Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Bennett Tyler with Aberdeen, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Engage Your Disengaged Workforce. Treat them like your customers. This webinar today is hosted by Aberdeen and is sponsored by Sage People. During this webinar, we will be talking about how to better manage employee relationships to cultivate tenure, how to leverage new technologies like AI and legacy engagement platforms to do so, and how to apply customer engagement strategies to employee-employer relationships to have some great benefits. Our presenters today are Zach Chertok, Research Analyst of the Human Capital Management Practice at Aberdeen, and Alex Farmer, Head of Customer Success at Sage People. I encourage you all to submit your questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A field on the left side of your screen. We will facilitate a Q&A at the end of the presentation to try to address as many of your questions as possible. Also on the left of your screen, you will see our resource section, where you'll find a copy of today's presentation slides, as well as some additional reading on today's topic. It is now my pleasure to turn the webinar over to Zach Chertok.
Thank you, Bennett. So in today's webinar, we're going to kick things off by going through Aberdeen's best-in-class methodology to provide everybody with a scope as to where today's data comes from in the context of our survey process at Aberdeen. With that behind us, we'll then jump right in with the shock factor of something frightening happening in talent management. In this section, we're going to look at what's happening with the talent strategy once an employee is brought into the organization. And just as a fair warning, it's not really that pretty. With an understanding of disconnects in the handoff to talent management, we'll look at how equating customer and employee relations can help build an equitable strategy for how to manage employees with some of the same tactics your company is currently using to retain customers in a long-term relationship. Next, we'll then look at engagement as a long-term issue that goes beyond the employee's initial commitment to the organization and everything that was sold to them in terms of getting them to want to work for your company. Finally, we'll wrap up by advocating for a new strategy and what that strategy means for your business value with respect to the labor organization. Throughout the presentation, we'll hear from Alex Farmer, as well as Bennett mentioned, on Sage's relationship to these concepts, as both of us take you through how our own personal experiences echo how the customer-employee management strategy relationship is a recipe for success. Without further ado, let's jump straight into Aberdeen's research methodology. Aberdeen routinely surveys the market across 16 different practice areas to understand trends in 4 main categories. The first one is pressures, which are the challenges, obstacles, or issues that cause organizations to think or manage differently. The second is actions, which are the strategies that organizations design and implement in response to the pressures. Third are the capabilities, which are the internal and external response processes or abilities that are already inside the company that are designed according to the devised strategies in response to the pressures. And then fourth are the enablers, which are the technology resources being used to facilitate the capabilities to carry out the actions in response to the pressures. Within the HCM market, Aberdeen surveys go out to practitioners to understand the strategies they're using inside their organizations to drive improvements in key performance metrics such as revenue growth and performance optimization. When we design our surveys, we have specific outcomes in mind that are categorized according to this PACE methodology. It's this PACE framework that allows us to speak to our readers in their own language, giving our content and the ability to relate to terms that our readers and today our listeners are likely to understand. Our surveys run for an extended period, at which point we then tabulate and process the data. Once we have our data set, we assign weights to the organizational KPIs that we asked about to divide the data set according to a clear definition of best-in-class, industry average, and industry laggard characteristics, with each one making up the percent segment of the data shown here. Our ability to associate certain capabilities and technology enablers with performance metrics helps our readers understand why it makes sense for them to adopt those strategies and tactics. Additionally, when a certain technology helps to support high performance, it can be useful for industry marketers to share the findings with end users to better understand how to optimize the results of their deployments. The data in today's presentations comes from 2 surveys that Aberdeen conducted within the last year. The first survey returned 204 respondents and looked at trends in all-encompassing human capital management challenges, strategies, and technology. The second survey returned 150 respondents and looked more specifically at employee engagement, incentivization, and general performance optimization across both talent acquisition and talent management. With the data description behind us, now let's take a look behind the curtain at something frightening in talent management. Aberdeen has found that 68% of best-in-class companies find that they suffer from low employee engagement. Something to consider, though, is that the best-in-class are 4.2 times more likely than all others to find that they do hire one of the top 3 candidates identified for a role more than 50% of the time. Together, these two statistics should be a bit concerning, since hiring a top candidate does imply it implies that a direct match source for a role akin to a lead being sourced to become a prospect and ultimately a customer in the sales cycle should guarantee some level of success in terms of driving engagement, getting them to want to work for the company, and everything that comes with it. The problem here, though, is that when employees are hired, their engagement beyond the hiring process does seem to wane pretty quickly and by a high margin. So what is somewhat clear is that employees are not being given the experience or resources that they're led to believe they'll receive when they're hired. And think about if this happened with a customer and what customer churn would mean for your customers on that level. Essentially, if you're not giving them the experience they were promised, how quickly are they going to cycle out after the initial sale, and what is that going to mean for your need to drive the next customer success? So next up, the best-in-class companies are 17% more likely than all others to actively recognize that declining employee engagement is depleting revenue per FTE. And we'll talk about how the resource strategy for talent acquisition relative to employee tenure is impacting this. Best-in-class companies today are 26% more likely than all others to be integrating performance management data sets to understand what makes for great employees. And this is a great area to try and understand what engagement looks like and how it contributes to the playing field. Across the metrics these companies are reviewing and per the strategies they promote for engagement, 71% of best-in-class companies, though, still consider less than 50% of their workforce to be highly engaged. Just 22% of best-in-class companies are now strategically focusing on how to address the sudden drop in employer-driven engagement in the transition from hiring to employment. It turns out that many of the engagement tactics in use are actually known to be effective in the performance lifecycle, but they are continuing strategies they're ongoing performance strategies when the fundamental issue with engagement is that when an employee gets hired, there's a strategic lack of bridging the talent acquisition process to the talent management process that's driving an immediate drop in engagement once employees are hired. And this period that we're talking about is the onboarding window, but the resources that employers are using are focusing on driving a continuation of engagement from the hiring process on into the workforce without accounting for the fact that they're going back to square one with engagement when a new hire comes into the company. So including more than half of best-in-class companies, spending on strategic candidate engagement is outpacing spending on employee engagement by more than 2 to 1. Given the surface visual of employee engagement having limited effect, this really isn't a surprise. Digging below the surface, it isn't really the fault of the engagement techniques in performance management that engagement is dropping, but the fact that those techniques aren't designed to rebuild engagement from stage one, as I mentioned, when there's no transition from candidate engagement to employee engagement, akin to the sales to services handoff in any productive sales cycle. As we jump into these parallels further to equate customer and employee relations, I'm going to hand things over to Alex to talk more about how Sage echoes this theme.
Thanks, Zach. I appreciate it. This is a really interesting topic for me because in my role at Sage People as head of customer success, our focus and passion is on ensuring that our customers achieve their desired outcomes with our product, with Sage People. And there's quite a few parallels with that compared to the employee journey that Zach has just mentioned. So a lot of economists and thought leaders have deemed the last 2 decades as the age of the customer. And I just want to spend a little bit of time talking through what that means and then move to discuss what I like to call the age of the employee. So one of the ways to address the engagement drop that Zach mentioned is by taking customer success practices to the HR space. But the reason customer success exists in the first place is because of the rise of the subscription economy. Over the past 2 decades, that rise has forced businesses to become obsessed with customer experience. And no longer were businesses selling widgets, if you like, relying on selling a product once. Rather, they need to retain their customers' revenue month per month or year over year. So in this new age of the customer, organizations are obsessed with customer data, and they spend a lot of money in systems to dissect that data. They employ artificial intelligence to ensure that they interact with their customers at the right time to make a maximum revenue impact. And they measure Net Promoter Score, as you can see there on the slide, which essentially is the pulse of their customer base. And I guess case in point, myself being the example, they establish entire teams dedicated to their customer success, the customer success function in these type of organizations. And in fact, that role, the role of customer success manager, is the fastest growing job title on LinkedIn today. Because of those trends, economists and business leaders have deemed these recent years as the age of the customer, as I mentioned. Now, as I said before, in my role as head of customer success at Sage People, we do practice that to our core. NPS, data insights, and running our business, from the cloud on dashboards is incumbent to the way we engage with our customer base. But how can we apply those concepts to the employee population? And why haven't HR and people functions adopted a similar methodology with the same popularity, if you like, as they have for their customer focus? If you really think about it, the employment contract is the quintessential subscription relationship, because in the war for talent, the employee has more power and leverage than the employer does, and that employee can cancel their contract with the company with 2 weeks or 1 month's notice. And the job of the employer is to retain the employee month over month and year over year, to engage that employee post-sale or post-hire, as we've just alluded to. Certainly sounds like a subscription. Now, obviously, we've established the premise here, and also established the engagement drop after hire that Zach mentioned is a huge problem, essentially akin to selling a product without the sales to services handover to make that customer successful, in this case, making the employee successful. But why do HR teams need to pay attention to this right now? And there are several trends that mean focusing on this post-sale or post-hire engagement is now more pressing than ever. And let's go ahead and review those. So just like the customer has more power in the subscription economy, as we said, they can cancel at any time, the employee has more power in this age of the employee. And that power or that increase is exacerbated by a skills crisis that's still ongoing. HR may be tired of the phrase talent war, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the war for talent is still a very real challenge that must remain at the top of the people agenda. And furthermore, productivity continues to remain an issue as well. Despite all the investments in technology, tools, and processes, not to mention changes in HR thinking, productivity has not seen any significant change. In fact, in more mature countries, productivity has actually declined on the whole. And what that means to us is that we still have not found the best answer for improving performance in the workplace. And as we've discussed, engagement certainly remains a challenge. Aberdeen research, the surveys they've collected, have statistics similar to this, in that the average engagement in the workforce is very low. I might suggest or challenge controversially that the majority of the people attending this webinar are not engaged. Now, hopefully that statement applies only to the workplace, and this topic is engaging to everybody. But only 15% of the workforce feel fully engaged at work. And that's a statistic from Gallup. Increased engagement contributes to higher performance and productivity with so much investment that's gone into this, but we're still not seeing the benefits in return that we should, which means there must be some other approach that we can take. There's a few more statistics here to really highlight the issue or the challenge. Aon and Burson have reported that global engagement dropped by 4% last year, and employees are feeding it back to their organizations as well via, let's say, Glassdoor, where the engagement score averages only 3.2 out of 5. Now, workplace technology is also transforming, but as we'll dive into a little bit later today, maybe not at the pace that it needs to ensure that employee engagement post-hire is maintained. In the 1980s, we saw the era of personnel, where the HR department was mainly focused on batch processing and the basic recording of keeping and storing information. We saw a shift toward HR and HCM, where HR technology and processes were more focused on making life easier for HR administration and reducing time to process transactions. But today, it's about the people of the business, the entire workforce, at least in our view. It's the age of the employee, as we established earlier. In a world where employees come to expect instant access to information and have the autonomy to do what they need when they need in their personal lives, that expectation inevitably carries over through to the workplace, which is quite a shift, leading to a series of fundamental changes in the way we manage and engage our workforce. And the workforce themselves has diversified as well. Right? We have 5 and soon to be 6 working generations, all of whom have different expectations in the way they work and what they can get from work. So the traditional one-size-fits-all approach to managing and engaging people is no longer fit for purpose when you take that into consideration. The approach that we use to engage these hires that our best-in-class organizations are hiring must fit the employee persona, which is a new way of thinking, but a way of thinking that has always existed in organizations focused on customers, with specific interactions for individual customer personas. And this, of course, is crucial to bear in mind as you consider the type of HR system you put in place. Obviously, systems and technology need to enable you to develop the agile and tailored processes and ways of working needed for success in the landscape that we've just established. So what's the silver bullet here? Right? What does this mean? Well, in the age of employee, in our view, it's all about experience. To address these challenges and improve productivity, companies need to rethink the way in which they manage and engage their people, just like the way businesses reimagined customer experience in the previous decade. Annual engagement surveys and the more traditional HR initiatives no longer work. It's the era of the employee, and they all have different expectations, motivations, and pressures that employers need to take into account. That one-size-fits-all that we discussed is no longer fit for purpose. Now, we did a survey a few months ago of several thousand employees, and that's the research that we alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, to ask them what they perceive to be a great experience. Now, some of their findings are here on this slide, and as I mentioned, in the research in the webinar console, which is also available on our website. So that's all well and good, but there's actually an economic or financial impact here as well. Right? As you can see, there's plenty of evidence that shows better experiences lead to increased engagement, which drives performance. And companies that focus on this, with the increased performance results, achieve higher business results, more revenue and profit, which I think is very compelling to these type of organizations and something that we see across our customer base, a trend that we see across our customer base at Sage People. With that, I'll hand over to Zach to take us through some additional trends.
Excellent, and thank you, Alex. These insights actually set us up really well to start to take a look at where engagement is actually happening right inside organizations. As we start to take a look at how the talent engagement structure and strategy should echo the most successful engagement strategy that any company invests in, which is the one between the company and its customers. So when we look at the talent acquisition side at the moment, it's kind of breaking down the two components between how we bring talent in and then how we engage it for the long run. Talent acquisition is actually doing a pretty good job. Aberdeen has found that on average 23% of companies are increasing spend at the top of the funnel recruitment process. The largest investments we're seeing are in sourcing and recruitment marketing to try and insulate against supply and demand in the talent market by creating both an inbound and outbound talent acquisition funnel for a successful talent pipeline. And that speaks back to what Alex talked about in terms of the war for talent. In the spirit of precautionary principle, however, companies do need to be careful not to promise a culture that doesn't exist. And as it turns out, this is a major point of contention that can exacerbate a drop in levels in employee engagement the minute a new hire starts to work for you. On average, Aberdeen has found that 20% of companies are increasing spend on the actual candidate management process. And while this includes applicant tracking and consolidation in the early applicant information record into the employee central system of record once an applicant becomes a new hire, it also includes pre-boarding, onboarding, and reboarding that insulates against engagement losses. By comparison, best-in-class companies in the sales cycle invest in the sales to services handoff by more than 60%. And as an anecdote, in my own career, one of the first things I was ever tasked with doing in one of my first jobs was applying project management strategies to build a framework that standardized the sales to services handoff. The company for which I was working was plagued with change order requests for service hours and customer engagement risks that were unnecessary, as project managers couldn't proceed beyond the service hour limit without further contract or company allowances. By standardizing this process on the customer side, we were able to reduce change orders by more than 60% and increase customer retention potential beyond the first 6 months of engagement by more than 40%. While this is a sales example, these kinds of metrics do apply for talent retention, as we'll see moving forward. Today, best-in-class companies are 22% more likely than all others to expand their use of automated credential, background, and personality tests as part of the screening process. By comparison, investment in automated documents management and e-signature capabilities sits nearly 1/3 below this tally for best-in-class companies. The best-in-class are investing in pushing paperwork and stage-gated management requirements behind the scenes in the process of handling candidates through the talent pipeline and making talent acquisition more engaging. The benefit of this is that they're eliminating stagnant procedures from the forefront that detract from engagement. We then kind of have to ask this question about, if they do this in talent acquisition, why not in talent management as well? Where is the handoff? When we look at some of the impacts of the buildup and engagement techniques in talent acquisition, we see that the best-in-class are 33% more likely than all others to be able to hire one of the top 3 candidates identified for a role. The main problem is that average tenure, particularly as we go down the employee age scale, hangs at 1.6 years. Meanwhile, average payback on labor once hired is at 2.2 years. And that's some serious food for thought when you think about employees actually starting to run in the black for your organization on a per-employee basis. When we look at building parallels between sales and talent acquisition, there's a lot of striking similarities already in place between the 2 corresponding elements in customer and employee engagement. Today, companies that align service and marketing programs around the customer realize 55% greater annual increases in customer satisfaction rates. It turns out, apparently, that giving customers what you advertise is a really good idea. On the talent side, 62% of best-in-class companies partner with recruitment marketing firms to realign talent strategies around the goal of the candidate. These companies are 66% more likely than all others to have realized a significant increase in productivity in the last 12 months. Now, this isn't to say that that productivity is over the lifetime of the employee, as we'll see, but they are getting that initial boost in productivity from the initial expectations on the employees in that 1.6 years. While this looks like a great alignment, when we pair this with the employee retention figure, it does stand to inference that employees are not always realizing the promise of what they're sold to accept the position, and as a result, they're not fulfilling the long-term productivity goals of the organization. When you have an employee tenure length of 1.6 years, and a payback period that demands 2.2 years, you can have increasing per capita productivity for the time that the employee is there, but still be losing productivity as an organization overall. In talent acquisition, best-in-class companies are 42% more likely than all others to find that candidate engagement is rising as their per-year increase in spend averages 23% year over year. In other words, as they sustain investment in per-employee engagement spending, these companies are seeing candidate engagement increase, which stands to reason. 68% of both the best-in-class and all others, though, are plagued by low employee engagement, and 55% of the best-in-class take this one step further to understand that the real issue in engagement is declining employee engagement with time, not the initial engagement once an employee is hired. In other words, short-term tenure is a problem, but the best-in-class are recognizing that they don't do enough to ensure engagement continuity or continuity of the employment promise to the employment reality akin to ensuring customer success. Up until now, we've heard a lot about building engagement, the value of mirroring the customer success strategy in talent acquisition and talent management, but what is it about engagement that makes it such a long-term metric in terms of its contribution to productivity? On the sales side of things, the average organization builds a sales to services handoff that ensures customer success by aligning acute customer needs to how the vision of the product or service can be carried out. After all, the success of the delivery is what defines the success of the relationship over the long term. 76% of best-in-class companies, which make up the top 20% of performers in Aberdeen's research methodology per the KPIs we ask about, fail to make the same bridge in the hiring technique, risking engagement drops because the employee has to chart his or her own success, respect to making the vision they were sold their reality. When looking at employee goals, something to consider is that respect to the vision sold to employees to join and stay with the company, much of what employees want hinges on a career track where they'll build a career at the company. Included in this breakdown is the good quality workplace relationships, the relevance of their work to the organization, a strong recognition by the company of the importance of their personal life respect to work, and the availability of interim labor investment options at a personal level that all feeds into a general career and salary growth set of opportunities. Today, best-in-class companies are 33% more likely than all others to recognize that a lack of strong employee relationships is causing these productivity losses, that short tenure that fails to realize running in the black. While employees expect to have strong, well-intentioned and professional relationships with their colleagues, it turns out that these are mutually beneficial to the organization through the promotion of longer tenure and a greater incentive for an employee to continue pursuing career growth inside the organization rather than abroad. The best-in-class are also 33% more likely than all others to find that a lack of employee relationships inside the organization rapidly contributes to employee disengagement. If we stop and think about this for a moment, no man is an island and no man likes to be an island. Under that assumption, it makes sense that if we let employees feel like they're on the outside looking in as they do their work, this is how they'll feel until they're so on the outside they'll leave. Furthermore, a lack of relationships does contribute to a sense of insecurity and risk that an employee is being targeted or is vulnerable to being targeted should things go wrong. Isolation is just not conducive to a productive work environment, and this is one place where customer management differs from regular employee management. While customers like to check in with others who may be facing similar issues, their cases are often better handled individually and with the development of mutual best practices. While both individuality and community relations are prized in customer relationship management and employee relationship management, their ratios are different in respect to each other. Today, 96% of the best-in-class are investing in building stronger links between employee performance data sets to identify where to deploy what resources to address and mitigate employee engagement risks right from the point of new hire transition, and to address both good and contentious employee relationships inside the organization that can lead to isolation, performance drops, or stress. And as we move forward with this, I'm going to hand things over to Alex again to look at how treating employees like customers is leading to providing amazing workforce experiences along the lines of a lot of what we've just talked about.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. So let's dive into it. And the way I've structured it here is around Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I think everybody's familiar with, and in our view, still a valid and valuable way of understanding what drives an individual and what needs they need fulfilled, although you can see we've updated it for the 21st century. So what I want to do now is take a look at each level and explore some of the ways in which you can build a great workforce experience around each need. We won't get into Wi-Fi and battery life because those are pretty self-explanatory. But let's start with the physiological aspect. That's kind of similar to the basic needs of food, water, warmth, and rest, and the most basic things that make someone feel safe. Right? And for this item, I think companies firstly need to ensure they're a great employer that people want to work for, and that authenticity accounts for a lot. So employees want to make sure that that the dream they were sold in the hiring process is something that they're experiencing once they join the organization. Employers should focus on creating a good place of work, an environment that is flexible for remote working as well, and ensure that the technology that's in place and other basic processes and tools are working right. Now, considering the different workforce expectations and changing nature of the workforce, right, with the 5 or 6 generations that we discussed before, we need flexibility so each individual employee can get their basic needs met from working at your organization. Now, the safety aspect here is kind of is similar to security, right? So it's about providing happiness and security at work and removing friction. From the moment a candidate is thinking about joining your company, you want to ensure that they have a consistent and seamless experience across the end-to-end employment journey with no, necessitation of a expectation reset from the hire to, joiner onboarding process, that, engagement gap that we've discussed. So giving them that sense of familiarity, safety, and security is key, right? That includes basic things like giving them access to details of their employment, contract, their benefits, documents, and policies, so they have access to those things in a frictionless way. To do that, self-service access, cloud, smart analytics, and reports are all examples of ways that HR can use technology to provide more seamless working experiences. Now, I think belonging is particularly important. This is about creating a sense of connection within the business and the team. We just discussed the challenge that not making close personal relationships at work can have on engagement post-hire. It's about the deep connection you get from feeling part of your team, the group, or the organization. It's scientifically proven that the human brain cannot handle more than 100 personal relationships. So it's important to enable organizations to make the ones at work count, right? And an HR tool can support that by giving easy access to team views and collaboration tools, but also ensuring that the HR system or the technology you use allows the organization to reflect the way it works. And what I mean by that is that an individual may be working in a more agile team, a group that's cross-functional, and making sure that the technology can support their collaboration as well is key. Now, if we talk about communication and feedback and using more agile methods in those areas, such as pulse surveys and targeted communications, those will make a bigger impact on that employee population. We have one customer that targets a one-question pulse survey once a month to their employee population, just a quick temperature check. Another targets communications and messages to their high-potential staff only to drip feed them opportunities for further development. And that allows the organization to tailor the sense of belonging to the diverse needs of their workforce. Now, things move so quickly that if an employee is disengaged for too long, they'll look to leave the organization, as we saw, right? So if we are going out and asking the one question to the individual, it's important to not take too long to act on their feedback. Making changes quickly and letting employees know when you've made those changes is really key. So you share so that the example of improving the onboarding experience from the candidate joining as a new hire and to get more feedback through pulse and ad hoc surveys is really important. So as we change our agile way of working, this is something companies must be able to do. So it's important to make sure that technology you have supports that. Let's touch on esteem. Everybody wants that sense of accomplishment. We addressed previously the desire for employees to grow their career with the organization that they've just joined. Recognition is really important. And in the workplace, it's about having that sense of success and attainment through work. So consider processes and tools to help you better link employee output to business performance metrics. The stronger you link these things, the stronger the financial business case for linking performance with reward, which is ultimately why people put in that extra effort. Now, just as an aside, reward can, of course, come in many forms, and that would be different based on the employee personas that you have in your organization. So one example of this is peer-to-peer recognition and informal feedback, right? So outside of the more static, traditional performance cycle. As an example, actually at Sage People, what we do is using the recognition module of our technology, employees are able to recognize other employees cross-functionally against the corporate values. But to really make that process stick and make it impactful in the organization, there's an automated report that gets sent from our system every month to our executive team. The executive team then shares selected peer recognition that is particularly impressive at our company all-hands meeting. And we actually provide a cash incentive for top givers and receivers of peer recognition, which is a great example of a truly embedded employee experience that is not just what we said we do at a hire process, but something that we've really embedded in the organization to increase employee engagement. And the last one I think we've touched on briefly already, but self-actualization is about helping employees to realize and reach their potential. So things like development, mentoring, promotion, coaching, and succession planning aren't just things that we should give lip service to during the hire process, but something that employees expect, especially our highest performing employees, once they've joined the business, and making sure that we take that, pass the baton from the hire to the talent acquisition to talent management frameworks is really important. as well. And with that, I'll hand back to Zach to take us forward.
Excellent. And thanks, Alex. With all the context of what we've talked about today, now let's look at what it means to actually advocate for a new strategy along these measures. The first thing to halt is that focusing disproportionately on talent acquisition and engagement there is resulting in higher success rates of hiring the top identified candidates, sure, but it's also reducing the likelihood of any guarantee of long-term employment success because it's neglecting engagement over the long term. As noted earlier, getting the formula right on talent lifecycle engagement management is important to running in the black on your labor investment. While hiring top candidates does net an immediate productivity boost, average tenure has dropped to 1.6 years, as I mentioned earlier, while the payback period requirement for talent to materialize has risen to 2.2 years. A lack of engagement investment, an increase in talent acquisition investment, and reductions in performance management effectiveness are increasing the cost per employee in the hiring process while reducing the likelihood that an employee will pay off. So this disproportionate investment is contributing heavily to the shortened tenure while similarly starting to actually lengthen the payback period. So if you kind of picture the leaky bucket analogy, as you start to fill the bucket up at the top end of things in talent acquisition, you've got a slow leak of engagement coming out the bottom, and no matter how much water you put in the top, you're constantly draining faster than you're filling the bucket. Something to note here is that this isn't a blanket excuse to stop hiring in favor of blanket automation. That would in essence be throwing the innovative baby out with the bathwater. While the gap between tenure and payback period has grown, there is a simple fix in terms of realigning the multi-stage employee engagement strategy. Furthermore, productivity gains are higher than ever in terms of that initial boost inside the 1.6 years, because employees that are coming in, while they may not be a perfect skills match and companies aren't necessarily training them for the exact skills needed, they are coming in with a higher skill potential than we've ever seen before. What this suggests is that productivity losses aren't mounting, but financial losses are due to the disproportionate focus on talent acquisition for in-the-moment jobs over talent lifecycle management to realize the potential of what employees can bring to the organization. Just as customer success rates are integral to company success, it is vital to reintegrate employee success into the customer success equation. Doing so will help identify where initial engagement measures can be tied to corporate profitability, even if indirectly, as in the case for how, for instance, marketing impacts sales effectiveness and service fulfillment that leads to profitability and customer retention. The time has come to invest in and support employee goals, more than 60% of which are directly engagement related. Use mentors to facilitate early and lasting employee relationships that lend themselves to long-term training and integration into the corporate way of doing things. Use performance management as a means for managers to not only identify where performance drops and gains happen, but also to identify what type of response is warranted and when and how it should happen. Think of your employees like you think about your customers. 71% of employees at best-in-class companies are looking for longer-term career growth beyond their initial role, and they're looking for strong internal relationships throughout the management hierarchy that help them surface those growth opportunities. The best-in-class are 77% more likely than all others to be rated as a top place to work and as a top employer of choice year over year. Their tenure is rising compared to all others as well, and a large piece of this goes back to that understanding that declining engagement with time is a major pressure driven by a dystopian reality in the workplace compared to what an employee was sold on as a candidate. Best-in-class companies are also 76% more likely than all others to find that more than 50% of their workforce is highly engaged, comparing that to the 50% or below metric that we saw before for all others. Considering the previous metric, this should not come as a surprise. What is maybe striking, though, is that the best-in-class are quantifying engagement through participation metrics in their employee performance management solution ecosystem. And this includes anything from rewards campaign initiatives to how wellness resources are consumed in times of high stress. They're amalgamating all of these resources to determine the nature of performance and productivity changes and to allow them to start to respond to personal changes in an employee's life, career track, instantaneous performance trajectory, so that they can start to respond on a more personal level, even though they may have limited resources to effectively get there. And finally, 72% of best-in-class companies are facilitating long-term employee growth and development, increasing retention and shrinking voluntary turnover. And a big way that they're doing this, again, is by implementing that bridge in terms of onboarding and automated documents facilitation to get a lot of that bureaucratic stuff out of the way when an employee joins an organization and gets into those first years of performance. They're engaging early learning management. They're getting them into the reward strategy quickly. They're finding mentors that are good personality matches for them, and they're starting to build a personalized ecosystem to transition the candidate that they focused on as an individual in talent acquisition to an individual in the employee management lifecycle hierarchy. And the only thing that now is really being standardized is the actual host of metrics that the manager looks at across the employee's performance relative to the performance of the department. But no more is the employee being caught up in this standardized benchmark system that forces them to be the ones to be in charge of their own skills development and to figure out where the resources are for them to do that. And as we start to wrap up, I'm going to hand things back over to Alex to talk a little bit more about these concepts, these metrics, and how Sage is participating in this particular dialogue.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, I mean, I think as you established, that companies are really good at selling, and as we've said, investment in talent acquisition is at an all-time high. But that parallel investment in management of that acquisition or the talent that you've acquired isn't there, right? Which leads to attrition, and as we've said, that causes a need for more investment on the top of the funnel, right? Just like organizations with a retention problem of their customers will throw more money at the marketing and sales teams to essentially sell their way out of a retention problem, which is the leaky bucket analogy that you mentioned earlier, Zach. Just to conclude here, to look at a few concrete examples of what HR teams can learn from customer success. I think firstly, the concept of customer segmentation is interesting. The essentially acknowledgement that each customer has different needs and that we need to approach those customers differently. What they're trying to achieve with a product may be different. Similarly, for employees, what they're trying to achieve at that organization may be different as well. So tailoring the experience to the individual is key. And we talked briefly about NPS or Net Promoter Score, but to drive that concept home, having a technology or a system that can send and facilitate pulse surveying as opposed to annual engagement surveys is really important. So understanding the pulse of your employee population, but also being able to target those surveys to different population sets to really understand, for example, how your high potentials feel or how your high performers are doing, or even get so data-driven as some of our customers have to look at people whose commute is longer than an hour and survey them about how the business could better support their transit into the workplace. And as we alluded to before, but to make very concrete now, it's pointless to do these type of pulse surveys if you don't get a fast response. As a customer, if you had a bad experience and you give a 0 or a 1 on an NPS survey, and nobody gets back to you or comes back with a platitude in 2 to 3 months' time, that's even worse, right? So having very quick feedback loops on these pulse surveys is really important. I think one example that really sticks with me is that one of our customers, to treat their employees as they treat their customers, has renamed their HR business partnering team to the employee experience function. So just like organizations focus on customer experience, this shift of organizations treating employees in that same way is actually being done in action, but also in name. So your employee experience partners who you go to improve that experience. So as we said here, that organization and other leading organizations are focusing on employee experiences, similar to the way businesses have focused on customer experiences for multiple decades. And it's now, I think, about more than an HR process, right? It's about a system needs to support an organization in a way that employees are used to being supported on an intuitive platform available on any device. As we said today, it's the age of the employee, and the technology you use needs to support those expectations in that age with things like those pulse surveys we discussed and the ability to tailor communications to different sets of your population, and also giving you the ability to know your employee population base. And what I mean by that, obviously, is the parallel to the phrase customer base to employee base. And it's really important that the system can do that with minimal IT expertise required. Something that can get you up and running quickly to be able to deliver those great workforce experiences for your people is an excellent way to continue to improve the talent acquisition to talent management engagement gap. And that's really where we see agile HR technology fitting in to fill that gap, if that makes sense. And just very quickly to address the report that you can download in the resource tab in the webinar console, which is on the left-hand side of your Q&A, right under the Q&A box. It's also available on sagepeople.com. But have a look at this research as well, which underpins some of what we talked about today. Thank you very much for the time, and I'll hand over now to Zach, who can conclude here.
Sure, and thanks, Alex. One thing that I just wanted to conclude with as sort of a general notion is that when we talk about feedback, when we talk about really listening to your employees like you listen to your customers, I think a lot of us out there, particularly in the customer strategy side, think that you're not going to get any feedback unless it's negative. And I think that that's been a little bit challenged in the sales side as positive feedback has started to come in when somebody has a really extraordinary experience or they learn something that they didn't necessarily know before. But in the employee side, that concept still largely holds true, that you'll hear back when a problem needs to be resolved. But we can think about that one of two ways. In the notion of negative feedback being negative and, oh geez, I have to deal with another problem. Or we can think of it as positive as I have feedback, I'm being told what the problem is, and I can respond to it. All feedback, whether negative, positive, or otherwise, is good feedback. And as we think about rebuilding the employee engagement strategy, your worst nightmare is hearing nothing. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to our moderator to start our Q&A.
All right, thank you very much, Zach. Before we do that, though, I do want to give Alex an opportunity to follow up on that. I think he might have some insight to share as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I appreciate that. I mean, this concept is really interesting to me, and Zach, that's a great point. I think organizations. I think some of that difference that you've established is because organizations in the HR function don't really have a track record or maybe a level of comfort asking for this type of feedback, right? I mean, that shift that we talked about from personnel to HCM to people is really important here, right? I mean, I think I'm comfortable saying that HR sometimes can be viewed in the more legacy sense of the viewpoints from the personnel definition as people that process data or a help desk for the individual. But as we know, leading organizations are moving in a direction that, the HR function is supporting the business in so many more ways and really leading the business as opposed to reacting to it. And I think what our customers are finding is when they ask for this feedback, firstly, their employees are just happy that someone asked, right? An employee, by having the ability to target an employee based on data at the right time, right? Just like, you maybe have a chat bot that pops up on a website, when you're a customer, for example, is really important because you're getting to the employee at the time that they need to be spoken to. Otherwise, they have a bad experience, and then they say, well, nobody really cares, and I'm just going to internalize that bad experience over and over again. That leads to burnout and disengagement. So having the ability to ask for that feedback is really an important first step because employees aren't used to that, right? And having a system or having a process to do that as an organization really improves that engagement. I'll also say, for an individual, even if we think about a slightly antiquated process like an exit interview, right? The reason I call it that is because we should be having interviews with our employees, not just when they're exiting, right? But I think that's also quite interesting because if you don't have a process to ask for that feedback, the employee is just going to post about it externally on Glassdoor. So giving them that kind of pressure valve or feedback loop to respond when an experience in the time and something doesn't go quite right during their onboarding or during their lifetime with the organization is really key because then you can take that feedback and react to it as opposed to having no place for it to go other than repressed, internalized, and posted on a corporate review website, which goes back to impact your employer brand, which then requires you to spend, as an organization, to spend more money in the talent acquisition process to sell that dream, which maybe you don't have established on the talent management side. So the process almost kind of spirals in a way. But yeah, I think that point is very interesting and really kind of a key first step for organizations to make this shift.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Alex. And that does conclude the presentation portion of our webinar. And we're now going to move officially into our Q&A. So if you have any questions for our speakers, you can submit them via the Q&A box you see on the left side of your screen. And to start us off, we have a good question here, and this might be on a lot of people's minds. It has to do with privacy, which is a big item right now these days. So how can HR know so much about their employees and act on those engagement issues while still ensuring full protection of personal data? Alex, is that something you could talk about from Sage's perspective?
Absolutely. So I'm sat here in San Jose, California today, but I actually am based in London, part of the EU. So GDPR still is very top of mind for a lot of our customers and certainly us as an organization. I mean, firstly, having a secure platform is important. Having a cloud-based, trusted platform where information is stored is key, and doing the correct due diligence to make sure that the organization that stores your data is storing it within, industry standards, but also in the correct location based on your locale. All of those things are really important, and I'm sure have the involvement of IT functions and things like that. The other aspect is transfer of data, right? Having employees being able to enter their own information in a secure environment into your system is a lot more secure, if you think about it, as compared to emailing it across, right? An email, is something that can get printed out, left on the printer, can get sent to the wrong person, and then there's a data breach that's happened because of the older way of communication that's being employed. So certainly, the cloud can be a little scary, and storing information on a secure server that's not in your premises can be a little bit scary as well. But, as I speak to our customers, my big challenge is what's the alternative, right? You take salary planning, for example. If you're doing compensation planning on spreadsheets, what's to stop a manager from clicking the print button? I know I do it, right? I'll click print on something and then forget that I printed it, and then 2 days later it's sat on the printer tray. So if we don't have a secure system to collect this data, to interpret the information, but also store it, for me, the alternative is actually less secure than having a cloud-based solution, because the older way of forwarding things and printing things out is actually less secure than having it stored in a password-protected environment. That's my 2 cents, at least.
Excellent. Thank you for that. This next question, Zach, I'm going to throw your way. We heard a lot of recommendations today and a lot of research, but what kind of functions do you recommend for successful onboarding and early engagement specifically?
Sure, that's a great question, and there are certainly a lot of onboarding consoles out there, but a lot of the combinations of functions focus on really 2 distinct separate processes with one analytics process in the background. The 2 processes on the surface that the employee has to engage with is the documents processing side, when they have to fill out all of their health forms, do the tax form filing, and get everything in with the HR payroll side. And those we really want to push as much to the back end as possible. So for elements that they might have filled out in the applicant strategy, we'd like to auto-populate those. E-signature capabilities are great. And just generally having not just the ability to let them sort of run through those as quickly as possible, but try to find a way to make them a little bit more engaging from the standpoint of, this might be your first login today. If you fill out the information, we'll auto-populate the rest, having it sequenced to the rest of the services. If you ran a background check on them, that means you already have things like the social information that can automatically populate in their payroll forms. And really, it's the devil's in the details with that particular piece that has to go into onboarding to minimize the amount of duplicate work and bureaucracy that the employee has to go through. The other piece of that, too, is providing direct access to the advisory services for things like healthcare plan selection, participation in the 401k, and all of the other things that they have to initiate upon joining the company. The last thing you want to do is throw it down on their backs and basically say, it's your problem, you deal with it. That's disengagement 101. The other piece of it is getting them into the early training, the early onboarding, and mentoring programs into that general sort of bucket that we call orientation. It's not enough to basically say we matched your skills to the job and you should be able to come in and just plug in and go. I don't even think with technology that we have that ability. All the technology has to be implemented and conform to the way our companies work. So labor works the same way. They're going to come in with the basic skills and capabilities we were sourcing, but the employee has to be configured for what the company needs. So you need to get them into early learning and development. You need to have a learning and development strategy that is as personalized to the employee as possible based on those early personality assessments that you might have conducted in the talent acquisition cycle. And it all has to bridge together to feed together into creating as personal an experience as possible.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Zach. I just want to do a quick announcement. We had a couple of questions come in like this. We will be providing a link tomorrow. We will send out an email with an archive of this. If you need to catch the early recording or want to share it internally, we will be sharing an archive of this starting tomorrow. So just a PSA there for everybody. And I do have another question, though, that I want to throw your way, Alex. What actions do you see organizations taking to increase engagement amongst their employee populations? From your customers, what's been working?
That's a great question. I think let's take an HR process. Let's use an example, right? Let's take an HR process that hopefully most organizations are doing in one form or another, which is performance management, right? If you're doing the more continuous conversation approach, that's more agile and kind of engaging in its own right because employees are being asked to engage with it more often. But let's say we have a performance process that we run every 6 months, okay? And I think one of the key things here is not treating it like a performance process, right? But treating it as an opportunity to engage with the employee population. Now, this is a phrase that I've coined, and you can tell it hasn't seen the light in any marketing department anywhere because it sounds a little cheesy, but we'll call it an engagement loop, okay? And let me explain what I mean by that. So taking performance management as an example, the first thing that needs to happen is you need to over-communicate with an employee, right? As much as we'd like to think in the HR space that employees like performance management, the reality is a lot of people view it as a pain or a hassle and something they have to do. So the first thing that needs to be done is effective training and communication. So training should be in the form of a video, right? Not a big document with screenshots. Lunch and learns are a little interesting, but for me, having a video that just shows someone who's recorded the process, talking through it for 2 minutes, and posting that video right next to the performance process itself is the easiest way to get an employee engaged about that process. So they have a question. Instead of logging a ticket with the question, they just push play. The information is there at their fingertips at that point in time, and they don't burn out before they even start, right? Because, again, if it's a process that people traditionally don't really enjoy, making it as easy as possible is really important. Now, alongside that help video, a lot of organizations will record a video of their chief people officer or HR director or even the CEO talking about 5 minutes or less why performance management is important at that organization. Here's why you should care, and here's how it connects to your day job, right? And here's why you really need to focus on it. And that, again, engages that user and really kind of uses it as an opportunity to sell that process right before the process takes place. So that's one, communication. The second is contextualization. So having the ability to place data at the hands of decision makers when the decisions are being made is incredibly important. And it also gives the HR team an opportunity to influence in a good way the decisions that are being made. So having data about, everybody on your team, here's their last performance rating, or here's what they have been doing for the last 6 months. Here's the employee recognition that they've gotten, and serving that information up to the manager as they do the performance review leads to a more thorough review, a more crowdsourced review, and to a review that employees will look at and say, yes, I feel that is an accurate representation about how I've done something or how I've performed, right? So that's the second one, contextualization, the ability to put data and insights at the hands of the decision makers right as they make the decision. The third out of 4 is actually completing the process, which needs to be done easily and should be pretty self-explanatory. So we do the performance review. And I think the fourth and final aspect of this loop is most important, which is surveys, right? We think of surveys as an annual engagement survey that takes 20 minutes and very few employees complete. But actually using surveys as a tool, a dynamic tool that allows individuals to respond in context is really powerful. So having a survey that says, how did it go? Did you think the performance process was a positive one? Do you think we as an organization pay for performance? Do you feel recognized for high performance here? What can we do differently next year? Having those type of communications right after the process continues that engagement. I did the thing HR asked me to do, but they're also giving me an opportunity to get to collect my feedback right there, right then, right? Now this loop kind of continues into the next review cycle because all that survey data you've collected about what we could do differently, you can take, influence the process, and then that next cycle, instead of the CEO talking about why performance is important, it could be the chief people officer saying, thanks so much for your feedback. Here's what you said about how we can improve our performance process for the needs of our business, and here's what we've done, right? And then immediately we're more engaged because we've shown the population that we're listening, right? So I think the answer in general, in sum, is that it's not an HR process, but rather kind of an opportunity to engage the population with that process as one of the four aspects, which is maybe more than you bargained for from asking that question, but I think an important point.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Alex. I think that was an important one. So I want to thank everybody, but that's all the time we have for today, and thank you for those of you who stayed a little extra with us. I want to thank Zach and Alex for sharing your research, insights, and recommendations with us, and thank you to our sponsor, Sage People, for making this webinar possible. We hope you found today's broadcast to be beneficial, and if you have additional questions, you can submit them via the Q&A widget. Thank you very much for your participation, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.